Hi everyone, welcome back for another year of Mike G's Eclectic Reads. I think this is going to be my first of the year. We'll see which one I actually end up posting first. Today's book review is going to be on a sort of true crime novel, the one that bends the normal parameters of the genre. We Keep the Dead Close by Becky Cooper. I'll admit right off the bat that although I enjoy detective stories and whodunits, I usually have stayed firmly within the boundaries of fiction in my mystery reading, so I am no expert on the true crime genre by any means. Still, when I watched an excellent and positive review of this book by Rincey from Rincey Reads, a review that I'll link below because it's super insightful and you should definitely watch it, I was intrigued enough to add this book to my mental list. And now, 9 months later, I've read it and I certainly found it enjoyable. In this book, we follow journalist Becky Cooper as she investigates an almost 50-year-old murder case of a girl who attended graduate school in archaeology at Harvard University in the 1970s. We learn from the very start of the book about certain rumors that arose at that time and have persisted to this day among graduate students in that department. Rumors that a certain young professor in the department, one who remains in the department 50 years later, had a hand in the murder. More than that, we also very soon begin to get the sense through the narrator's casual interviews that the case was mishandled by the local police department and possibly even covered up by the university to avoid scandal. And this foreshadows themes that will be explored throughout the book, themes of scandal, sexism, and corruption at elite and established institutions, whether Harvard University or the Cambridge Police Department, themes that are explored quite well, in my opinion, in a way that gives them real legitimacy, but without leaping to unwarranted conclusions. Or rather, when people do leap to conclusions, and this is rarely the narrator herself, because she's incredibly meticulous in her investigations to corroborate the things she hears, she explores not only how these conclusions might be erroneous, but also how our tendency to jump to such conclusions might be illustrative of larger psychological and societal concerns, even if the conclusions themselves ultimately prove false. One thing that intrigued me about the book was that in Rincey's review, she was quite open about the reason she normally doesn't enjoy true crime novels because of their voyeuristic nature, the sort of morbid fascination that we find in other people's actual misery. I haven't thought about this topic nearly as much as she has, so I won't comment on it here, and instead, I'll just recommend you watch her review for a better discussion of this topic. What I will say, though, and what Rincey observed too, is that this book does not totally follow the conventions of the typical true crime novel. The narrator and her narrative style show a certain self-awareness about the strangeness of this whole idea of meddling in some unsolved crime that's mostly really none of our business. Some reviewers did find it a bit hypocritical for the author to make this observation 1 minute and then proceed with the investigation the next, which is fair, but I personally think there's a place for respectful exploration of such themes. In the book itself and in interviews with the author that I watched later, I saw a real sincerity in Cooper's investigation that went beyond the desire for a compelling story, even if that desire was certainly part of it. Now, whether it's marketed that way or simply as another true crime story is another question, but one I'm not going to explore here because I don't know much about that, except that I personally probably wouldn't have touched it if not for Rincey's review saying this was not your ordinary true crime novel. So in my case, at least, it wasn't really the more lurid aspects of the story that appealed to me most. Becky Cooper openly explores the reasons for her own fascination with the life and death of the murder victim, a young woman named Jane Britton, the simplest one being that she sees a lot of herself in Jane. And in doing so, Becky retains a clear presence as a character in the story she tells, often inserting herself into the narrative, drawing parallels with Jane's life, or using the combination of Jane's and her own experiences to draw broader meaning from these stories. Not everyone likes this stylistic choice, and many reviewers, including to some extent Rincey, pointed out that Becky sometimes stretches a bit to justify these parallels between her and Jane's stories, or she over-describes her own experiences in the process of investigating rather than focusing on the facts of the investigation itself. I, however, somewhat disagree on this point because although it's not always perfectly executed, I think Becky's inclusion of herself in the story is not just valuable but critical, as it's what gives this story the level of self-awareness that distinguishes it from other true crime investigations. In fact, as a true crime novel, this is not actually the most interesting crime investigation. Though the premise is certainly compelling, without giving any spoilers, it was clear to me by at least halfway through the book, if not earlier, that the whodunit of this crime hardly even matters. By exploring the ways in which different accounts and rumors and misconceptions arise in response to such a crime, Becky makes the story more about that meta-narrative and what it reveals about us and about the social structures around it. Thus, the most important reason for Becky's insistence on including herself as a character in this story is that it allows her to acknowledge and explore the way in which she herself, as a historian or archaeologist of Jane's story, is projecting her own experiences, her own meaning, onto another woman's story, how she's drawing messages that can at best be described as subjectively true, since as is explored from very early on in the book, history has no inherent meaning and thus takes on whatever meaning the writers choose to give it. Because of this fact, Becky retains an admirable sense of personal responsibility throughout the novel to explicitly acknowledge any conclusions she's leapt to and reflect upon how her own experiences color her interpretation of Jane's and others' stories. None of this would have been possible if Becky participated in the story merely as a third-person narrator with some implicit impartiality. Not that it would have even changed that fact anyway, that Becky's telling of this story would still be inherently colored by her own experiences, whether she acknowledged it or not. And because of this, where I think this book goes astray is in the second half, where Becky's narration subtly transitions into something less personal and more purely investigative as she tracks down more and more potential suspects, most of whom we know from the start must not be involved simply due to the unrelatedness and the sheer number of them. And the unfortunate effect here is that in her focus on the specific details, the narrative begins to lose some of its allure as a meta-true crime narrative, so to speak, but without the crime investigation itself actually gaining enough momentum to even be compelling as simply an ordinary true crime narrative. And I think this is why many readers, myself included, found ourselves disappointed in the second half of the novel, becoming increasingly bored with the tenuous connections being explored, instead just waiting impatiently for things to finally wrap up, solution or no solution. Still, within the best parts of the novel, we get not only a nice blend of investigative journalism and personal reflection, but an exploration of broader themes such as how we write history. One particular recurring idea that I loved was this theory that someone floated past Becky early on in the book, that there are two types of archaeologists or historians. There are storytellers and scholars. When this point is first raised, there's a not too concealed implication that the scholars are the ones who do the real work, and then the storytellers are the ones who receive credit or attention for it by promulgating these discoveries to the rest of the world, packaging them into meta-narratives, and often even exaggerating them in a way that doesn't let a few facts get in the way of a good story. This is probably an idea that we could apply to many other fields too, beyond just history, like the life sciences or physical sciences or other social sciences, but history is perhaps an especially well-suited field for exploring this idea because, as I think Becky comes to realize, without some kind of a framing story, there simply is no meaning in history. The facts and artifacts we unearth do not alone tell us anything about the world in which they were created. They need a context or a story in order to be understood, even if that story is ultimately a human invention that some critics will argue reduces the purity or objectivity of historical study. In fact, we could take that discussion a lot further, but I'm not going to, other than to mention I found it especially interesting because for about the past half year or so, I've been listening to a great series of YouTube conversations between Davud Gozli, John David, and Daniel Garner of OG Rose, covering an essay collection called Tropics of Discourse by Hayden White. It's a complicated sounding title right off the bat, but the three of them do an excellent job of dissecting these essays for at least a somewhat broader audience. And their discussions, which I'll link in the description section, dive deeply into this topic of meta-history, or of how we frame historical events within certain narratives, and the accompanying philosophical questions like whether it's possible to present a truly unbiased or objective account of history at all. And for the record, after watching most of their discussions by now, I'd have to say I think the answer is no, which I think is why also Becky, by the end of this book, comes to appreciate the value of a good storyteller, albeit a storyteller with at least some scruples. Becky even begins to explore a different kind of truth in the storyteller's account, one that is not to be taken literally, but rather as revealing something about the story and about the very storytellers who keep it alive. Much like, say, ancient myths, which historians recognize are not factually accurate but still contain other deeper truths. Cooper discovers through her research on the accounts, stories, rumors, myths about Jane's murder, that a lot of it is just baseless speculation, and yet its very existence and continued foothold within the student population reveals something about our attitudes and fears about other societal issues. For example, Jane's story, unfortunately, seems to serve as a cautionary tale to female graduate students in Harvard's anthropology department. There's an unmistakable current of feminism running throughout this book, and not in a way that I found preachy, but rather one that explores genuine and disturbing grievances by women, especially those in academia, who have faced pretty indisputable harassment, or worse, all to have it waved away by the higher powers who don't want to face up to it, or even who just see it as a necessary and normal part of the progression up the academic ranks. I think where Becky Cooper really gets this right, though, is that she's quite reflective about where her story does and doesn't fit into the traditional meta-narratives of feminism. For example, in one scene early on in the book, there's a brief mention of how, until as recently as I think 1999, women graduating from Harvard still had listed on their diploma Radcliffe College, which was basically the female companion of the all-male school Harvard until sometime in the 1970s when the two merged. Becky presents this basically as an outrageous instance of entrenched sexism, which is how she saw it at the time, and some might still argue that it was. But then later in the book, we do hear a different opinion from one of the first female graduates, I think, of Harvard College, or one of the last female graduates of Radcliffe, who basically laments that this more recent removal of Radcliffe from the Harvard diploma almost seems to erase her and her classmates' place in the university's history. Of course, there's validity to both of these perspectives, which is the point, and ultimately it's an example of how I admire Cooper's continual efforts to probe deeper and follow up on her initial reactions. In a similar way, the author manages to critique the elite university and to expose its contradictions, but within a narrative context that isn't as categorical or self-certain as we often see nowadays. There would have certainly been a temptation for the author, given the current popular societal meta-narratives, to portray Harvard exclusively through a lens of elitism, building up this ivory tower image of the elite academic institution, something so powerful that it could even cover up a murder. Which, don't get me wrong, she does portray Harvard precisely this way, but it's not the only way she portrays it, and she doesn't imply that we should take any of these portrayals entirely at face value. She encourages us instead to read between the lines and find out what's true in these portrayals and what's not. We see this commitment in even the smallest details, and it's just done so well. For example, at one point, she tells us about a battle between the tenants' advocacy organization and the university over this matter of student housing that doesn't lock properly, the housing where Jane was murdered. Here we see the school criticized, but through the voice of the tenants' organization, not directly through the author. And the author follows up then to find the reasons the university gave for not fully securing this building, which aren't completely clear-cut, even if you might still believe the university has the ultimate responsibility here. This narrative style effectively prevents Becky from ever becoming too forceful, let's say, in trying to make you believe something. So hopefully by now I've at least convinced you that there is a lot to be admired in this book, despite some of the shortcomings I and others have noticed. In the end, I'd still absolutely recommend reading this book if you're interested, but I just have to throw in a few caveats. First of all, don't read this book if you're simply into true crime and looking for that kind of story. It's simply not that, and even Becky Cooper herself said in an interview with Politics and Prose that she didn't conceive of this as a true crime book when she was writing it. That's in fact why I think a lot of people, myself included, really enjoyed it. But because of that, it then may be a slog to get through the later sections of the investigation. It was for me, at least. So just be forewarned. If it still sounds interesting to you for everything else it has to offer, then I encourage you to give it a shot and let me know what you thought of it. Have you read this book or others like it? What genres or themes stood out to you in this book? Do you think it fits within one or more genres, or does it simply defy classification? Did you find the deeper cultural and philosophical explorations interesting, or did the slowness of it all just bore you? Let me know what you thought, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to see more reviews of books. Is probably about as specific as I can really promise right now. Until next time, bye, and happy reading.